The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of a sleek, modern living room filled with expensive furniture, art, and the quiet hum of a ticking clock. The father, a weathered man in his late 60s, sat on a leather armchair, his eyes soft but tired. Across from him stood his son, sharply dressed in a tailored suit, phone in hand, clearly distracted. The father leaned forward, clearing his throat, trying to start a conversation he had rehearsed many times in his mind. "My son," he began gently, "you're not getting any younger. Have you thought about settling down? About finding someone to build a life with?" The son sighed deeply, not even looking up at first. "Dad, please. We've been through this. I don't need a wife. I'm doing fine. I've got work, I travel, I'm not interested in that whole thing." The father's face tightened with disappointment, though he tried to hide it. "You may think you're fine now, but life isn't just about work. When you grow older, you'll want someone by your side. Someone to share your days, your joys, your pain." His son chuckled dryly. "Why does everyone think love and marriage solve everything? It's a trap, Dad. I've seen it too many times, people pretending, arguing, falling apart. I'm not going to end up like that." The old man leaned back, defeated. He looked around the room, so beautiful, yet so empty. He pulled out an old photo from his wallet and placed it on the table. It was of his late wife, smiling gently, holding a younger version of the boy now standing in front of him. "Your mother and I didn't have much," he said softly, "but we had love. Real love. I wanted the same for you." The son picked up the photo, glanced at it for a second, then put it down without a word. "I'm not her. And I'm not you. Please, stop trying to control my life." Without waiting for a reply, he grabbed his keys and walked out, leaving the door swinging quietly behind him. The old man sat in silence, eyes fixed on the photo, a spark of quiet resolve beginning to build behind his sorrow. The house was quiet now, its silence broken only by the soft creak of the wooden floor as the old man slowly paced his room. It was late, well past midnight, but sleep refused to visit him. The earlier conversation with his son played over and over in his mind like an unwelcome echo. He had hoped, even prayed, that his son would see the value of companionship, the beauty of love. But instead, he was met with cold logic and walls of pride. The rejection wasn't just about marriage, it was about something deeper. A growing distance. A missing connection. The old man moved to a small wooden desk in the corner of the room. It was old, scratched by time and use, but it still held his few important belongings. He sat down slowly, exhaling deeply, and opened the drawer. Inside lay a small notebook, its pages yellowed and worn. He pulled it out and opened to a blank page. He began to write, not a letter, but a plan. A strange, risky, almost foolish idea had been forming in his mind since the door had closed behind his son. If his son couldn't see the value in love, maybe he needed to be shown. Not told. Shown. And not with lectures, not with pressure, but through experience. Through life. Through someone pure-hearted, someone humble and sincere. But how could he find such a person in a world where appearances meant everything? The idea felt wild, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. He would step out of his own world, the world of comfort, money, and expectations. He would become someone else. Someone poor. Someone overlooked. A beggar. He stood up and walked slowly toward the closet. From the back, he pulled out an old bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were clothes he hadn't worn in decades, faded pants, a torn coat, a woolen cap with a missing thread. He held them up, staring at them with a strange mix of discomfort and determination. He laid them carefully on the bed. Then, opening a small box, he pulled out a gold ring, his wedding band. He kissed it softly, placed it back inside, and locked the box. If he was to do this, he had to do it completely. No traces of who he really was. No pride. No comfort. Only truth. He sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the clothes, his notebook lying open behind him, his heart heavy but oddly hopeful. Tomorrow, he would walk out of this house not as a father or a businessman, but as a man on a mission. A mission to find love, not for himself, but for the son who had forgotten what it meant. Morning broke slowly, with a gray sky hanging low over the city. A slight chill filled the air as people hurried through the streets, wrapped in coats and scarves, minds already occupied with the demands of the day. Among them, almost invisible, sat the old man, no longer in his crisp shirt and clean shoes, but in worn-out clothes, a faded coat too large for his frame, and a wool cap pulled low over his graying hair. His once bright eyes now appeared dull beneath the weight of his disguise. He sat on the edge of a stone step outside a busy market, a tin cup in front of him, empty and waiting. The city was alive. Vendors shouted out prices. Children tugged at their mothers' hands. The scent of roasted corn and fresh bread filled the air. But no one noticed him. They passed by without looking, some avoiding his eyes, others pulling their children away as if poverty were contagious. The old man sat still, observing. He didn't beg, not with words. He simply sat and watched, letting the world reveal itself. As time passed, he began to see more than just hurried feet and blank faces. He noticed patterns, how some people would glance at him and quickly look away, ashamed. Others would scoff. A few would toss coins without making eye contact. But he wasn't searching for money. He was searching for something else, something deeper. He was looking for kindness. A child approached, holding his mother's hand tightly. The boy stared curiously at the old man, tugging his mother's arm. "Why is he sitting there?" the child asked aloud. The mother didn't answer. She simply pulled the boy away faster, her eyes locked straight ahead. The old man smiled softly, not offended, but reminded of how invisible the forgotten can become. Hours passed. The cold crept into his bones. His legs ached. His pride whispered that this was madness. But he ignored it. Every face that passed was a possible clue, a possible beginning. Still, no one truly saw him, not until late afternoon. A woman, maybe in her late 20s, stopped in front of him. She wasn't well dressed, but she was neat and modest. Her hands were full, groceries, books, a tote bag, but she set them down and crouched beside him. "You must be cold," she said softly. Her voice was gentle, without pity. "Here," she added, pulling out a small plastic container of food from her bag. "It's still warm. I was going to have it for lunch, but you need it more." The old man looked into her eyes. They were kind, calm, and unafraid. She didn't flinch at his appearance. She wasn't rushing. She was present. He took the food with trembling hands and nodded slowly. "Thank you, my dear," he said hoarsely, carefully staying in character. She smiled faintly. "Take care of yourself," she said, rising again. "You matter." And just like that, she was gone, disappearing into the crowd like everyone else. But something in that brief moment made the old man's chest tighten. For the first time that day, he felt hope. Maybe she was the one. Or maybe she was just the first of many he needed to meet. Either way, his journey had truly begun. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the market square. The old man remained in his spot, motionless, the chill of the stone beneath him slowly seeping into his bones. His fingers, gnarled with age and stiff from the cold, rested on his knees. Hours had passed, and his body felt the weight of both the disguise and the mission he had chosen. He had been ignored by dozens of passers-by, some offering quick glances, others avoiding him entirely as if his presence was a blemish on their day. But he stayed patient, eyes scanning the crowd, heart quietly hopeful. And then, she appeared again. The same young woman who had offered him food the day before. Her clothes were simple, a plain sweater, jeans, and a scarf wound loosely around her neck, but she carried herself with quiet confidence. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and though she looked tired, her eyes remained bright. She noticed him right away and crossed the street without hesitation. This time, she didn't bring food. Instead, she held a small thermos. "I thought you might like some tea," she said with a gentle smile. "It's chamomile, good for calming the nerves." The old man blinked in surprise. He accepted the thermos carefully, as though receiving something sacred. "You're too kind," he murmured. She sat down beside him on the edge of the stone step, placing her bag next to her feet. She didn't look at him with pity, nor did she speak as though she were doing charity. She simply treated him like a person, an equal. "My name's Amina," she said after a pause. "I come through here on my way to work." He looked at her, carefully studying her expression. "Work?" She nodded. "I teach at a local school. Just part-time for now. It doesn't pay much, but I love it. Kids are honest. They keep you grounded." The old man smiled faintly. There was no arrogance in her voice, no attempt to impress. Just honesty. He nodded. "Children do see things clearly." Much more than grown-ups, sometimes. Amina glanced at him and chuckled. You sound like someone who's seen a lot. I've lived a little, he replied carefully, keeping his cover intact. Enough to know kindness when I see it. Her face softened. Not many people stop, do they? No, he said simply. They see what they want to see. They sat in silence for a few minutes, sipping tea. Around them, the world moved fast, cars honking, vendors shouting, people rushing home. But in their small corner, time seemed to slow. Amina stood finally and reached into her bag. She pulled out a pair of woolen gloves, slightly used but clean, and handed them to him. It's getting colder. I thought you could use these. The old man was touched beyond words. He took the gloves gently, nodding. You don't know what this means to me. She smiled again, this time warmer. Take care of yourself. I'll see you tomorrow, if you're still around. And then she was gone once more, swallowed by the crowd. The old man sat back, heart beating steadily. He wasn't certain yet, but something inside him stirred. This woman had no idea who he was. No idea why he was there. And yet, she had given more than anyone else. Not with money, but with humanity. A rare thing in a fast-moving world. He stared down at the gloves in his lap, and for the first time in days, a quiet smile formed on his lips. The next morning came quietly, draped in a blanket of soft clouds. The old man, still in his humble disguise, awoke early and took his place once again near the market. But this time, he wasn't there to be seen, he was there to observe. His mission was changing shape, taking form. He had found someone kind, someone different from the world he'd grown weary of. But kindness could be momentary, a gesture in passing. He needed to know more. Was Amina truly as sincere as she appeared? Was her compassion consistent, even when no one was watching? When she arrived, she greeted him with the same warmth, placing a fresh sandwich in his hands with a simple, "Good morning." She didn't linger today, just a kind smile and a wave as she continued on her way. But he was ready. After a moment, he rose, tucked the food carefully into his bag, and followed from a distance. She walked briskly, weaving through the city streets with practiced ease. She wasn't rich. Her shoes were worn, her bag fraying at the edges, and her coat a few seasons out of fashion. But she walked with purpose, her head held high. The old man followed cautiously, staying just far enough behind to remain unnoticed. Amina's first stop was a corner bakery. She stepped inside and emerged a few minutes later with a paper bag. Instead of taking it with her, she crossed the street to a group of street children who had been lingering near a bench. Without fanfare, she knelt down, handed them the bag, and shared a few kind words. The children beamed. She laughed with them for a moment before standing and continuing on her way. The old man's heart stirred at the sight. She hadn't known anyone was watching. There were no cameras, no crowd, no reward. Just goodness, natural, unpolished, and real. He continued to follow her as she entered a modest school tucked between tall buildings. The sign outside was old and slightly chipped. He waited across the street as children poured through the gates. Then she appeared again, now inside the classroom through a large window. She smiled as she spoke to the students, her hands animated, her energy vibrant despite her humble surroundings. He watched for nearly an hour, seeing the way the children responded to her, with respect, joy, and affection. She wasn't just teaching, she was connecting. There was no act here. No performance. She lived the same way she had treated him, genuinely. When the school break came, she stepped outside with a few students. One of them tripped and scraped a knee. Instantly, she was beside him, cleaning the wound with a tissue from her bag, whispering something comforting. The child nodded bravely and gave her a smile of gratitude. The old man exhaled slowly. Every test he had silently given her, she had passed. She wasn't just a moment of kindness in a sea of indifference, she was a constant light in an often dim world. As he turned to walk back to his place by the market, he felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest, something that had been missing for a long time. It wasn't just hope anymore. It was belief. Maybe, just maybe, this woman was the one his son needed. Not someone perfect, but someone real. Someone who didn't care about wealth, appearance, or power. Someone whose heart spoke louder than any words. He returned to the stone step, sat down slowly, and pulled the sandwich from his bag. He took a small bite, still watching the road where she had disappeared hours earlier. Tomorrow, he thought, he would take the next step. But for today, he was content. Content knowing that goodness still existed, and that he had found it. The next day arrived with a cold wind sweeping through the streets, tugging at scarves and rattling leaves along the pavement. The old man, wrapped tightly in his threadbare coat, stood a little farther from his usual place outside the market. Today wasn't for waiting. Today was for beginning. The truth was, Amina had passed every silent test he had given her. And while he still had doubts about how his son might react, about whether he was right to interfere, his heart urged him forward. It was time to take the first real step toward connection. Just after 8, he spotted her again. As usual, she moved quickly, holding a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and balancing a shoulder bag in the other. She noticed him immediately, her steps slowing, her face brightening. "I was wondering if you'd be here," she said warmly. "Cold morning, huh?" "It is," he replied, his voice still raspy, still in character. "But you always bring warmth, Miss Amina." She laughed softly. "You remembered my name. I never forget kindness." There was a pause. Then she hesitated. "You know, I've been thinking. You're always here, and you seem different from the others. I don't mean that in a bad way. You're quiet. You observe. You're thoughtful. Do you have somewhere to stay?" He looked down for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Shelter, now and then. Enough to get by. But it's not home. Just places with roofs." Something in her expression shifted, concern, yes, but also a growing curiosity. "Would you let me buy you a hot meal? I know a small place nearby. It's not fancy, but the food's good." He hesitated just enough to seem unsure, then gave a slight nod. "If it wouldn't trouble you." Together, they walked toward the quiet side of town, where small family-run cafes still clung to old traditions. Inside, the scent of soup and baked bread filled the air. The waiter looked surprised when Amina brought the old man in, but she paid him no mind. They sat near the window, and she ordered 2 bowls of lentil soup and bread. The conversation started slow. She asked simple questions, where he was from, how long he'd been living this way. He gave careful, vague answers. A man who had worked once, lost his family long ago, drifted through cities. He didn't lie, not entirely. He simply left out the identity he had left behind. But as they spoke, something else began to happen. Amina didn't treat him like a project or a charity case. She truly listened. She laughed when he made a dry joke. She shared a story about her students. One had drawn a picture of her as a superhero, cape and all. "They think I'm brave," she said, smiling shyly. "But I just try to be kind." "Kindness," he said, "is the greatest kind of bravery." Her eyes flickered toward him, and for a moment, there was silence. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. Have you ever been in love?" The question struck him harder than he expected. He blinked slowly, emotions stirring under the surface. "Yes," he said softly. "Once. Long ago. She passed, but she taught me everything." Amina nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I don't think love ever truly leaves us. It just changes form." He looked at her, and in that moment, he saw not just a kind stranger, but a woman full of wisdom, empathy, and quiet strength. The soup arrived. They ate in peace, a strange pairing to any outsider's eyes, but something meaningful had begun. A bridge was forming, not just between 2 people, but between the old man's hope and a future he hadn't dared to imagine for his son. As they stepped back out into the cold, Amina smiled. "Same time tomorrow." He nodded. "I'll be here." And as she disappeared into the busy street once more, he knew in his heart that this wasn't just part of his plan anymore. He was no longer acting. He was feeling, deeply, and for the first time in years, something inside him was healing. The next morning brought a quiet nervousness the old man hadn't felt in years. He sat on the edge of his bed, not the stone steps he'd come to know, but the modest room he had been secretly renting under a false name. It was simple and bare. A wooden chair, a narrow bed, a suitcase filled with his real clothes folded neatly in the corner. The disguise, his torn jacket, faded trousers, and woolen cap, lay across the bed like a second skin he was now used to wearing. But today, as he looked at them, he hesitated. This journey had started as a clever test, a mission to find a kind soul for his son, but now, it had grown into something more tangled. He hadn't expected to feel so connected. So seen. With slow hands, he put the disguise back on and walked through the morning fog toward their usual meeting spot. Amina was already there, leaning against the side of the building, sipping tea from a paper cup. When she saw him, her face lit up with that now familiar warmth. "I was beginning to think you'd changed your route," she said playfully. "Never," he replied. "I wouldn't miss seeing a friendly face in the cold." She offered him half of her sandwich. He accepted it gratefully, not because he needed it, but because the act itself felt sacred, something between trust and affection. They sat on the bench nearby, and for a few minutes, said nothing. The silence between them had grown comfortable. Then, Amina glanced at him with quiet seriousness. "Can I ask you something more personal?" He looked at her gently. "You can ask me anything. Do you have family? Anyone still in your life?" The question made him pause. He looked down at his hands, old and calloused in their performance, then back at her. "Yes," he said slowly. "A son. But we've grown apart." "Why?" He exhaled, the breath long and heavy. "He's successful, proud. But he's built walls around his heart. I think he's afraid. Of love. Of being hurt. He says he has no time for such things, but I think, he just doesn't want to be vulnerable." Amina didn't respond immediately. She just listened. "I used to think it was my fault," he continued. "Maybe I was too strict. Too focused on making him strong instead of showing him how to be soft. But now I just want him to find someone who reminds him how beautiful life can be when it's shared." She placed her hand gently on his. "He's lucky to have you. Most people don't fight for their loved ones the way you clearly do." He looked at her, the sincerity in her voice washing over him. "Would you ever be open to meeting someone who's not perfect, but trying? Someone who's forgotten how to feel, but deserves to remember?" She tilted her head curiously. "I think everyone deserves that." "Why?" He hesitated. His throat tightened. This was the moment he had feared, and yet hoped for. "Because I know someone like that. Someone I care about deeply. And I think you might be exactly the person who could reach him." She blinked, surprised. "You mean your son?" He nodded. "I know this may sound strange, but if I told him about you, what you've done, how you treat people, he might listen. He trusts me, even if we're distant. I think, he could see something in you he's been missing." Amina was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled gently. "Tell him, then. I'd be open to meeting him." The old man swallowed the emotion rising in his chest. "Thank you," he whispered. As she stood to go, she gave him a small wave. "You know, you don't have to keep sitting out here in the cold. I have an extra chair in my classroom. Come by sometime." He smiled. "Maybe I will." And as she walked away, he knew what had to come next. The hardest part. The reveal, not just to Amina, but to his son. The truth about who he had become to find love for someone who didn't even know they were missing it. Tomorrow would be the day. The following day, the sun broke through the gray winter clouds as if blessing the moment with soft, golden light. The old man stood in front of his full-length mirror, dressed no longer in tattered rags or worn shoes, but in a tailored charcoal gray suit. His shoulders were square, his chin cleanly shaved, his silver hair combed neatly back. It had been weeks since he had worn his real clothes, weeks spent blending into the world of the forgotten to test a stranger's heart. Now, that stranger was no longer just a kind face. She was something more, someone he believed could bring his son back to life. He stepped out of the modest room, walking with the steady grace of the man he had once been in the world, respected, powerful, and feared by some. But that version of him had always felt incomplete. Now, with his purpose clear, he felt whole for the first time in years. Later that afternoon, in a quiet corner of a nearby cafe, he met with his son. Dressed in a designer coat and a sharp tie, the younger man arrived with a confident stride, his phone in one hand, barely looking up. "Father," he said, sitting across from him. "You said it was urgent." The old man studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Tell me, do you still believe love is a waste of time?" His son frowned. "We've been over this. I'm not interested in relationships. I don't trust them. People only want what they can get from you. And I don't have time for emotional games. And what if I told you I met someone who proves you wrong?" He asked quietly. The son smirked. "You met someone? Where? At one of your board meetings?" The father reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a pair of worn woolen gloves, the same ones Amina had given him days earlier. He laid them gently on the table. I met her as someone else. As a man with nothing. And she gave me these. Not because she knew who I was. Not because she expected anything. But because her heart is good. The son looked at the gloves, confused. What are you talking about? I disguised myself, the old man said simply. I lived for weeks as a poor beggar. I sat outside in the cold, day after day. I watched people pass without looking. But she stopped. She fed me, spoke to me, listened to me. His son stared at him, stunned. You did what? I needed to know if there were still people out there who didn't care about money or status, people who lead with compassion. And I found her. Her name is Amina. She's kind, honest, resilient, everything I want for you. His son leaned back in his chair, stunned into silence. She doesn't know who I really am, the father continued. But I told her about you. She's willing to meet you. And I think you should say yes. Not because I'm asking, but because if you don't, you'll miss the chance to know someone who could change your life. The younger man looked down, wrestling with the weight of the truth. For a moment, the hardened exterior cracked, revealing something vulnerable underneath. You really think she's different? I know she is. Later that evening, the old man returned to the stone steps where it had all begun, dressed once again in his humble disguise. And there, just as he hoped, Amina arrived, carrying a small thermos and a sandwich. She stopped when she saw him. I wasn't sure if you'd still be here. He stood slowly, and then, without a word, removed his hat and coat. Underneath was the clean, pressed suit. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Wait, what is this? He stepped closer, gently taking her hand. My name is Malik. I'm not homeless. I'm the owner of a large company. But none of that matters. What matters is this: I needed to find someone genuine, someone whose heart is pure. And you were everything I hoped for. Tears welled in Amina's eyes, not from betrayal, but from the overwhelming truth. I wanted to test kindness, he said softly. But I never expected to find someone I'd truly admire. She didn't speak for a moment, then finally smiled through the shock. So, what now? Now, he said with a hopeful smile, you meet my son. And just a few steps behind him, the young man stood, watching, his heart already beginning to soften. It wasn't just the end of a test. It was the beginning of something real.